early October 2025, just as Crimea entered what was expected to be a quiet autumn, the sky over Feodosia erupted into chaos. A wave of 251 Ukrainian kamikaze drones tore through the night, homing in on a single vital artery, the Feodosia oil terminal, the last major functioning fuel depot in occupied Crimea. This wasn't just a dramatic escalation, it was a message. Is Ukraine rewriting the rules of energy warfare? With a storage capacity of 250,000 tons, Feodosia had been the logistical heartbeat for both civilian infrastructure and Russian military operations. It fed fuel to the Black Sea Fleet, supported air defenses, and powered tanks scattered across the peninsula. As the terminal ignited, so too did the illusion of Crimea's self-sufficiency. For many on the peninsula, the flames symbolized something far more devastating than just lost fuel. They signaled the start of total entrapment. Leaked footage verified by BBC News and geolocated by open-source analysts revealed waves of drones bypassing Russian air defenses before slamming into storage tanks. Each detonation triggered secondary explosions, painting the night sky in orange and red. Experts at Military Watch magazine noted that the strike overwhelmed layered defenses by deploying multiple drone types simultaneously, some decoys, some explosive. In effect, Ukraine executed a digital-era blitzkrieg, cheap swarms, overwhelming expensive static systems. But why Feodosia, and why now? According to a retired NATO logistics officer quoted by Al Jazeera, this was the final cut in a months-long operation designed to isolate and starve the peninsula of mobility. In strategic terms, this wasn't an isolated strike. It was the culmination of what the Kiev School of Economics now calls the Crimean fuel trap. The attack marked the collapse of the last internal energy reserve, and with it, the last shred of logistical flexibility for Russian forces stationed there. This moment also embodies the domino effect analysis. A single oil terminal destroyed in hours has triggered cascading failures, halted civilian transit, stalled military readiness, and frozen local economies. From fuel to food, from hospitals to harvesters, the peninsula is feeling the ripples of that night. And as Ukraine refines its drone technology, reportedly now integrating NVIDIA Jetson-powered targeting algorithms, the tempo of these strikes is set to increase. Could this be the future of warfare, where a single well-placed strike can choke an entire region? How would Russia respond if it loses its capacity to hold Crimea through fuel-dependent logistics? What happened next would expose how completely Crimea had already been trapped. By mid-October 2025, Western intelligence reports confirmed what many had suspected: the drone strike on Feodosia wasn't a standalone incident, but the final phase of a calculated logistical siege. How did Ukraine manage to isolate the most heavily militarized region in Russian-occupied territory? The answer lies in months of targeted disruption, each move severing Crimea's vital supply lines one by one. Was Crimea already a dead end before the flames even rose? This wasn't just strategy, it was domino effect warfare in real time. The first domino: Crimea's local fuel infrastructure. Even before the Feodosia inferno, Ukraine's drone raids had crippled refineries deep inside Russian territory. Notably, the Tuapse refinery in Krasnodar, formerly responsible for a large share of Crimea-bound fuel, was knocked offline after repeated hits in late summer. NASA's firm's satellite data revealed sustained thermal anomalies at the site, confirming extended fires and widespread damage. As internal reserves shrank, Russia had to import fuel via external routes that soon became death traps. The iconic Kerch Bridge, once Putin's crown jewel, was the next target. Ukrainian naval drones, possibly aided by satellite guidance and AI-driven navigation systems, struck its understructure repeatedly. while the bridge still stood its capacity for heavy vehicle transit, was effectively neutralized. A single fuel tanker crossing could now spell collapse, a risk no Russian commander would take. The sea was no safer. Ukraine transformed the Black Sea into a battleground where civilian ferries became reluctant pawns. Explosive naval drones confined Russia's Black Sea fleet to port, and also discouraged oil tankers from docking. DW reported that major marine insurers had raised premiums by over 800%, making oil shipments economically unfeasible. Many ship owners refused to risk their vessels, and ferry services were repeatedly suspended due to what Moscow vaguely called terrorist threats. With roads and seas compromised, Russia turned to rail. But Ukraine anticipated this. Special forces and partisan groups launched a series of low-intensity but persistent sabotage operations. Explosives planted along tracks, electronic warfare attacks on signaling systems, and nighttime ambushes paralyzed logistics trains heading into Crimea. Defense News cited classified assessments, estimating that the rail line's capacity had dropped by 70% in just 6 weeks. Trains that did make it through carried barely a fraction of the fuel Crimea needed. This phase reflects the opportunity cost analysis. Each delivery option Ukraine closed forced Russia to divert not just resources, but strategic focus. Units once tasked with offensive operations had to be pulled back to guard railways, protect bridges, and escort convoys. Each destroyed track didn't just mean a loss of fuel, it meant fewer battalions pushing forward on the Zaporizhzhia front or the Kherson axis. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, this was the most comprehensive energy siege seen in modern hybrid warfare. The entire peninsula had been turned into a besieged island, its lifelines methodically cut. Yet just as Crimea was being choked logistically, something even more destabilizing began to unfold on the streets. As October 2025 deepened, the consequences of Crimea's energy entrapment spilled from military strategy into daily civilian despair. Gasoline, once mundane and abundant, became a rare commodity. Long before sunrise, queues formed at every functioning gas station, often stretching miles. Isolated from outside supply, Crimea was now surviving on fumes. How long can a population endure when even basic movement is denied? Footage from telegram channels inside Simferopol and Sevastopol showed desperate citizens lining up with jerry cans, some waiting 2 days, only to be turned away. Over half of all gas stations had already shuttered. At those that remained open, black marketeers emerged from the shadows. According to DW, the official price for gasoline surged to 80 rubles per liter, but on the black market prices eclipsed 200 rubles. This was no longer a shortage. It was an economic breakdown. In a desperate throwback, the Kremlin reinstated a Soviet-era rationing system, limiting each citizen to just 20 liters. But this measure only inflamed tensions. Locals accused Russian-installed officials of corruption and favoritism. Military convoys were seen bypassing queues, sparking fury among civilians. One viral clip even showed a group of shouting Crimeans blocking a fuel truck headed for a base, demanding it be redirected to hospitals. Here, the strategic contrast perspective becomes clear. Russia's portrayal of Crimea as a stable, integrated bastion of the Russian world now clashed violently with images of children missing school ambulances parked idle and bakeries shuttered for lack of power. Even public transportation came to a halt. People could no longer get to work or reach relatives. Hospitals ran low on diesel for generators, forcing makeshift triage operations. Western analysts were quick to note the psychological collapse underway. Al Jazeera reported that civilian morale in Crimea had reached historic lows not seen since the early days of occupation. Russian sociologists speaking anonymously to the Moscow Times revealed rising cases of panic buying, and a growing sense of betrayal among Crimeans who had once supported annexation. And while the streets grew angrier, the Kremlin's response remained hollow. Promises to restore supply routes within days proved impossible to fulfill. The Kerch Bridge remained under threat. No commercial ship dared approach Feodosia's coast, and even the railways were increasingly seen as suicide missions. The chaos on the streets became a metaphor for the system's unraveling. Tanks and missiles had protected Crimea for years, but now it was a gas can that could spark collapse. Ukraine's energy siege had moved beyond infrastructure. It was now dismantling the social fabric. Would the collapse of civilian life bleed into the battlefield? As the fuel crisis deepened, all eyes turned to Russia's 60,000 troops stranded on the peninsula. By late October 2025, military analysts from NATO's Joint Forces Command issued a chilling assessment. Russian forces in Crimea were operationally paralyzed. While the guns remained, the fuel to fire them was running dry. Could Ukraine's fuel denial campaign turn Crimea's 60,000-strong garrison into a sitting target? The short answer: it already has. With the Feodosia depot gone and external supply lines effectively severed, Russia's occupation forces are now dependent on scattered, dwindling fuel reserves stored across the peninsula. But Ukraine's strikes didn't stop at Feodosia. Satellite analysis from the Institute for the Study of War confirmed that Sevastopol's storage terminals had also been damaged by coordinated drone swarms just days after the Feodosia fire. Each strike on a depot wasn't just tactical, it was surgical, removing one more lung from Crimea's military body. This is where the opportunity cost analysis comes into sharp focus. Every liter of fuel allocated to a military convoy meant one less for ambulances or generators. But even within the armed forces, choices grew agonizing. Should commanders power up S-400 missile batteries to defend against future drone strikes, or save fuel for armored vehicles in case of a Ukrainian push? According to a BBC defense analysis, some Russian units had begun implementing fuel rotation schedules, meaning only select brigades could remain mobile at any one time. Without mobility, modern warfare collapses. T-90 tanks worth millions now sit idle in fields. Helicopter squadrons remain grounded, and warships already battered by naval drone threats can no longer afford to patrol Crimea's coast. A senior fellow at Rand Corporation noted that Russia's war machine in Crimea has become a museum of static hardware. This is Ukraine's strategy formalized under the codename Operation Deep Strike, launched by Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky. Over 2 months, 85 high-value targets were hit across occupied and Russian territory, 33 military installations, and 52 industrial or fuel-related facilities. According to data from Military Watch magazine, this strategy directly slashed Russia's capacity to project power beyond its immediate defensive perimeters. But there's also a strategic contrast in play. Crimea was supposed to be Moscow's fortress in the south, untouchable, heavily fortified, and bristling with high-tech defenses. Instead, it's now a vulnerable, crumbling outpost that drains resources without returning strategic value. Even Russian military bloggers, often propagandistic, have begun questioning the peninsula's viability. And this has NATO's attention. In a recent briefing, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg noted that Ukraine's energy interdiction model sets new standards in hybrid warfare, combining economic disruption with precision kinetic strikes. Sources from DW report that US and UK advisors have already begun studying these tactics for possible application in future deterrence strategies, especially in the Baltics and Arctic logistics corridors. Yet, as Crimea's military stagnation becomes undeniable, the same playbook appears to be working across the Russian mainland. As Crimea reeled from energy paralysis, Russia itself began to feel the aftershocks. By the end of September 2025, data from Moscow's energy ministry confirmed a staggering 38% of the country's oil refining capacity had been taken offline. Was Ukraine's strategy expanding from regional disruption to nationwide destabilization? Indeed, this wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Military Watch magazine and Reuters jointly reported that over 70% of Russia's refinery disruptions in Q3 2025 were directly attributable to Ukrainian drone attacks. Among the hardest hit were strategic facilities, the Kryvyi plant in Leningrad, Russia's second largest, and the Ryazan refinery, both forced to halt operations indefinitely. Together, these accounted for nearly 236,000 tons per day of lost processing volume. The dominoes kept falling. Russia's gasoline output for September dropped by 1 million tons, creating a 20% domestic shortfall. With demand outstripping supply, the Kremlin responded with a drastic move, a full ban on gasoline exports. But even that wasn't enough. As reported by the NYT and Al Jazeera, Moscow began seeking emergency imports from Belarus and even waived customs duties for fuel coming from China, Singapore, and South Korea, an embarrassing reversal for a country that once wielded energy as a diplomatic cudgel. This situation underscores the domino effect analysis again. A single successful campaign in Crimea has echoed through the arteries of Russia's national energy system, rippling into refineries, trade balances, and domestic prices. What began as a regional drone operation has triggered macroeconomic strain at the heart of a petrostate, and the impact didn't stop at energy. On October 10th, the State Development Bank (VEB) revised its forecast downward, confirming a 0.6% GDP contraction for 2 consecutive quarters, a textbook technical recession. Even Sberbank's conservative president, German Greff, broke ranks and admitted that the economy had entered a phase of prolonged stagnation. To cope with ballooning defense budgets, the Ministry of Finance proposed raising VAT from 20% to 22%, shifting the economic burden onto ordinary Russians. This economic pain is strategic. Ukraine's strikes haven't merely destroyed infrastructure, they've created opportunity costs. Each refinery lost to drones not only requires billions to repair, but also diverts funds from other critical sectors: education, pensions, social stability. The war is no longer just on the front lines, it's in grocery bills, unpaid salaries, and delayed public works. According to DW's recent Energy Summit coverage, Western governments have taken notice. NATO economists now study Ukraine's strikes as models for future economic warfare. The U.S. National Defense University published a brief stating that energy denial has become a weapon more potent than conventional artillery. And the most ironic twist, a nation that once threatened Europe's energy stability now finds itself begging allies for fuel. Russia's doctrine of energy-based power projection, once a pillar of its geopolitical identity, is imploding. Yet, as Russia's economy creaks under this burden, the symbolic collapse is happening in a place that was once Putin's prize, the peninsula that launched his empire. By mid-October 2025, the symbolism of Feodosia's burning oil terminal had overtaken even the strategic implications. What once stood as a pillar of Putin's geopolitical triumph, Crimea was now exposed as his empire's Achilles heel. Could Ukraine's energy siege be the wedge that fractures the Kremlin's myth of control? The visuals tell their own story. Endless fuel queues, children missing school, and soldiers parked in silent tanks, all in the shadow of a once invincible fortress. The Kremlin's narrative of prosperity and permanence in Crimea has collapsed under the weight of jerry cans and empty gas pumps. Russian television's attempts to frame the situation as temporary fell flat, as leaked footage continued to circulate globally. This is the essence of the strategic contrast perspective. Crimea, once hailed as the unshakable crown of the Russian world, now bleeds logistical failure and social unrest. Instead of showcasing Russian dominance, it reveals systemic decay. The very territory that was meant to project Russian power now absorbs that power's limitations. The puppet administration in Crimea, left without meaningful support, has become a lightning rod for public fury. Their pleas for calm are drowned out by anger. Telegram channels overflow with videos of protests, blocked roads, and citizens accusing officials of hoarding fuel. Even the military has grown visibly nervous, dispatching internal security units not to fight Ukraine, but to suppress unrest in Sevastopol and Simferopol. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues its campaign with surgical precision. NATO officials in off-record briefings with NYT and Defense News confirm that over-the-horizon coordination between Ukrainian intelligence and US ISR intelligence surveillance reconnaissance assets has accelerated. Drones are now being launched with near real-time satellite targeting, improving hit accuracy and evasion success rates. Western experts suggest this evolution in Ukrainian strategy is part of a broader shift, where soft power logistics denial and strategic sabotage may replace conventional warfare in contested regions. As retired U.S. General Ben Hodges remarked in a recent DW panel, Ukraine has shown that modern wars are won not just with tanks, but with terabytes and turbines. This evolution worries Moscow. Russian military bloggers have begun to question whether holding Crimea is still viable. A leaked internal FSB report cited by Al Jazeera warns that continued loss of infrastructure without the ability to rebuild may lead to de facto strategic abandonment, regardless of public rhetoric. Even in the heart of Moscow, the myth is fracturing. Economic elites are reportedly pressuring the Kremlin to reassess its long-term Crimea strategy, fearing irreversible international isolation and economic stagnation. When the moneyed class begins to shift, political earthquakes often follow. But the final verdict may not be written in war rooms or Kremlin hallways. It may rise instead from the oil-streaked roads of Crimea, from mothers without fuel, to take their children to clinics, from soldiers who can no longer rotate out of positions because there's no diesel to move them. So now the final question emerges. Can Russia continue to hold Crimea under this deepening siege, or has the tide already turned?